You're listening to Necropolis. This is a podcast brought to you by Jason from Goatcraft and Shelley from HateMeditations.com.
We got this Condemner guy on the podcast today. So it's just Shelley and myself interviewing Condemner. Condemner is a death metal band from the DFW area. Initially started around, I guess, like 2015 is when the demo came out.
2015 is also when we started. It was late summer, early fall of that year when I started making that demo.
All right. Yeah, 2015 is when all this stuff started. And he did have Jacob Holmes on vocals, which Jake Holmes has returned for the newest Condemner album. Shout out to Jake. I told him I would give him a shout out. He's rehearsing today at Churchside. I would have liked him to be on this episode, but you can definitely hold your own, Paul. So the new album came out earlier this year. I know with the Latin titles, you're supposed to pronounce it like it's Italian. So we have Mel Per. Oh, I can't pronounce this crap.
The way I pronounce it, which is probably wrong because I took Spanish in high school and thus always default to that for Latin. The way I pronounce it is Mala Patratis Sunt, Atra, Theatra, Parata.
Glad you did that because I wasn't going to attempt it.
Yeah, I think it has you need a little bit more of like an Italian accent to be a little bit more authentic with your Latin. But yeah, not judging you there. But yeah, the new album.
Well, it's funny because the grammar is incorrect anyways because it's a historical reference and the people who wrote it historically got the grammar wrong. So it's all 2 layers off anyways.
Yeah, need a little bit of spaghetti in there. But yeah, so like Shelley stated, we will kind of just do a retrospective on Condemner. We'll get to the new album, and it could possibly trail off into other avenues here, since we're all quite opinionated. So the demo started in 2015 with Jacob Holmes. I noticed there's a really sterile sounding, no offense, drum machine on it, but however,
Correct.
I know it's more the riffs are really the focus of Condemner. So how did that come about? You just, you were practicing guitar and decided one day that death metal is better than black metal? Because I read one interview you did around 2016 where you stated that you were initially drawn to like playing like black metal on guitar, but you made the transition to death metal after seeing Imprecation play live.
Correct. So let's go back in time. 2009. Early in 2009, I was primarily a black metal guitarist. I had some black metal songs written. Then in 2009, when Imprecation reformed, I saw them live and just had my mind totally fucking blown. Like, it had the darkness that I had always associated with black metal, but it was united with this physical energy that is, of course, death metal oriented. And then after that show, like, that was when I switched over to playing death metal. And in fact, I got home from that show, drove from Houston back to Dallas, and that day started writing the song that would become the title track to Burning the Decadent.
That's interesting.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, it's quite interesting that Imprecation was the catalyst because they're relatively unknown. They're more of like an obscure death metal band outside of Texas, but inside Texas, they're definitely legendary. But you don't really hear that many people bringing up Imprecation outside of specific circles. So it's kind of interesting that you were really influenced. I mean, I did some shows with Imprecation, not me playing with them, but on the same bill. And they're always fucking solid live.
Oh yeah.
But they've had so many lineup changes, and now it's like Frankencation. They're still pretty solid. And I noticed you also mentioned Blaspherian, also a Houston band, as a big influence, which They definitely had a unique stage presence. It's like if you want the true like experience of like rumbly death metal, Blastferian is your go-to for that. Like I've never heard a band like that live just being so rumbly. Very effective, the way the riffs are constructed, and the low end really, grants it a distinct character. But that's kind of interesting. Like the two, main influences are relatively less known Texas death metal bands. Usually, like when people,
I would say that they're the inspirations more so than the influences. If you look at the exact mechanics of the music, aside from a couple of songs here and there, there's not that much imprecation in it, and especially not as much in some of the newer stuff. It's more the inspiration than a direct influence, I would argue.
Yeah,
Small difference, but kind of a key one.
Yeah, so getting to Burning the Decadent, which was as you said, like the debut album released in 2018. And it is it's almost exactly what you think of when you think of black and death metal, in that the term is massively overused and misused across extreme metal, in my opinion, these days. But it takes the riff language of death metal and tries to re-inject that early sense of darkness, and our co-host Tyler would often refer to it in a band like Possessed or something, in that it's quite linear, but it has that dark swirling atmosphere of early black metal as well, and it's that's something that maybe hit its peak around when Deicide released Legion, but it comes through on Burning the Decadent. But it's an interesting album as well, because I believe that was also a drum machine as well, but you don't hear that in that kind of music.
Well, at that point, I did not have a drummer, so I just did what I had to do. If you don't got a drummer, do it yourself. Easy drummer can do an okay job, so that's where it was.
Yeah, no, it works. Like it sort of calls to mind something like Profanatica, in that sense, because Paul Ledney's drumming is very direct and just there's no flashy stuff on there, but it exactly does the job. And sometimes in death metal, you get a lot of drummers that are technically dazzling, but it can sometimes be a distraction from the music itself.
Yeah, and in general, like the way I write drum parts, and even on the new album, even with a human drummer, most of the drum parts were originally written by me, and then just my drummer MB took a pass over them. And like when I'm writing drum parts, I'm primarily thinking of having them guide the dynamics of the song, because on an electric guitar, it's not like a violin or a trumpet where like you could control how loud or soft the part is by playing it differently. A distorted guitar amp is going to be as loud as that volume knob is, so you can't really change that volume by playing harder or softer. In order to keep the music, from being just completely flat, you've got to have something in there that can bring volume up or down, and that's how I use the drums. So like, for instance, if I need a louder part, I'll have it go to a full blast. And then if I need it like to quiet down on the same riff, I'll just like back off to a double kick or even like a skank beat or something like that. And that's where I'm usually approaching the drums from, is just something simple, but something that guides the dynamics of the song as it needs to be.
Yeah, it's interesting that, because the last track on Burning the Decadent is instrumental, and it's getting on for like 20 minutes long, which again you don't often see in this kind of music, but it really does draw out that idea of just almost like minimalism in a way, but expressed through dark death metal, in that it is exploring that interaction between rhythm and dynamics in a form of music that isn't really known for its dynamics. As you say, a distorted guitar is just going to be as loud as it is. So,
well, it's funny that everyone always brings that one up as an outlier, that song, because I did not intend it to be. Like, I know I've told this story in another interview, but the first time I timed it, I was practicing it to a metronome, and that metronome had a timer on it, and I saw that it was like close to 19 minutes long. I was like, okay, no, I must have made a mistake here with the timing on the metronome here. There's no way this song is actually 19 minutes. I figured it was just another Condemner song about 7 minutes long, and I hadn't even, I didn't even have any intentions of making it an instrumental yet. I figured I'll write lyrics for it at some point in the future because I'm always lazy when it comes to writing lyrics and do it last minute. And then like the second time I timed it and got 19 minutes on it again, I'm like, oh wait, what the fuck did I do with this song?
So I saw an interview where you mentioned that you try to focus more on the noumenon than the phenomenon, which comes from Immanuel Kant. And with Kant, he viewed that time and space are a priori. Do you think there's something messed up for a priori there when the duration of a song is much longer than you anticipated in that regard? Like, it surprised you that it was 19 minutes rather than 7 minutes. Do you think perhaps your intuition in terms of time could be a little faulty there?
Oh, for certain. But I mean, one thing is that a lot of musicians, or at least for me, will tell you that like when they start playing their instrument, you kind of lose track of time. You don't. It's weird because like your sense of time all becomes relative paced to where you are in the song. And so like that song had a certain narrative. It doesn't have that many riffs in it per se. So, I just know my sense of time is where I am in that song's narrative. And however it is however it is when I'm playing it until the first time I set it to a metronome and I'm like, wait, what the shit? So it's like I mean, my sense of time obviously wasn't accurate at all, but it's like your sense of time when you're playing music, or at least in mine, it's all relative to where I am in a song's narrative. It's not relative to time outside anymore.
Yeah, time is really like how we measure it. That's more of a social construct, like minutes, seconds, milliseconds. That's all abstract. They don't really exist in reality. It's a social construct we have to quote unquote tell time and make sense out of it and how it passes. So I can see that you just lose yourself in the music, and all of a sudden it's like my a priori nature is a lot different than the external world.
So Arthurian imprecation, the inspiration for Condemner. As Jason mentioned, not big outside of Texas, but I happen to have heard of them because I move in certain circles online. But who would you say are the key influences for Condemner?
So in terms of influences, Profanatica and Sarcophago in a lot of the details of the riff stylings. And then also the first Darkthrone album, Soulside Journey. There's an ongoing joke between me and EC before he flaked out and left the metal scene that everything I write sounds like some era of Darkthrone, but it's kind of true because you'll see like, Soulside Journey influences all over everything I've written in Condemner, and then in the old black metal stuff that we never actually released. You'll hear a bunch of Transylvania Hunger and Under a Funeral Moon influences all over that. So Darkthrone, and then the big one, Morbid Angel. The way I build my songs is pretty much all stuff I picked up from studying Morbid Angel songs when I was learning guitar. That is the biggest one in terms of song construction and how I build songs out.
That's interesting. Like, I did not pick up on the Morbid Angel at all when I checked out Condemner. I definitely picked up on the Profanatica, maybe like a little early incantation type of influence there, but not Morbid Angel. So is that more like like your?
It's funny on that one because people who have worked with me have told me it's like they didn't hear it until they like because. Okay, one thing is that, of course, we're down-tuned a lot, right? Our tuning is down in B, but other musicians I've worked with, when they've just been jamming the songs on a guitar that they've had that was tuned to standard, they're like, wait a minute, if you play this stuff at a guitar that's tuned to standard and just speed it up a little bit, it all just turns into Morbid Angel songs. It's like, yep, it does.
Yeah, that's interesting actually, because I as well, I didn't pick up on the Morbid Angel until you said it, but then in going back to it, you can see it there in a more explicit way than just in the fact that most death metal has some Morbid Angel in its DNA. So yeah, that was on the death metal side. Yeah, definitely hear the Profanatica, and it's interesting you were mentioning Darkthrone because I think I think, correct me if I'm wrong, Jason, but Soulside Journey is your favorite Dark Throne album?
By far, because black metal Dark Throne is for girls.
I
Yeah, I
actually
didn't
agree
mean to
with
put, like,
Jason on that one. Soulside Journey is my favorite one too.
fair enough. I mean, it's a great album, don't get me wrong, but fair enough. And it is, I don't know, because obviously it's famously anomalous. And it's just, I don't even consider it really the same band that made something like Transylvanian Hunger, but yeah, that's by the by. Um, cool. So yeah, and then you've recently released this new album with a Latin title that I won't attempt to pronounce, but yeah, and for me, the although I believe you this wasn't sort of a conscious decision, but for me, it really brings forward the early incantation in that it's much slower, in some sense more minimalist, more down-tuned, but there's definitely kind of like a Death Doom undercurrent to it, but it still has that. It has a percussive kind of tendency and a bit more, what's the word? A bit more dynamic in places as well. But was that a conscious decision to sort of slow it down and make it slightly more brooding, or did it just
Not
happen
really.
naturally?
Like the tempos aren't that far off from Omens of Perdition demo. And it's actually less doomy, I would argue, because it has a lot fewer sections with just the drawn out held power chords on it. It's got a few here and there, but they're not like just the huge centerpiece of the song the way they are on some of the older stuff. Like I did consciously try to make it a little bit more rhythmic, and that I think is part of what you're hearing, because like on a lot of the older stuff, it's very even in its rhythms. You know, there's just constant tremolo pick, whether it's palm muted or not. You know, this one has, aside from track 5, has relatively little of just the constant tremolo pick. It's got a lot more of the down picked palm muted eighth stuff. I did want to make this one more percussive because, so one thing I felt about the previous album is that I felt both lyrically and musically, I was getting away from some of that physical nature that death metal has. You know, it's like going back to the inspiration. I've got to have that collision of both the darkness and the physical energy, and I felt like I was losing a little bit too much on the physical energy side. So there was a conscious attempt to inject some of that in here, and that made it more rhythmic. I think, you know, that led to a lot more of the palm muted, chunky stuff. But I don't really hear it as being a doomier album. If anything, less so, I think, than especially the demo, but a little bit less so than the previous album as well.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because yeah, in some ways it is a more diverse album in that regard, in that the kind of the various like influences you can hear on there are kind of brought to the fore, but in a lot of ways it is a lot more minimalist. I think pound for pound the tracks tend to be longer, even though there's not like a 20-minute track on here or anything like that, but each track does feel quite extensive, but also much more like focused. And I think the interesting thing is this was done with a real drummer, but in some ways it's it's almost like more repetitive, but in a good way as far as I'm concerned, than Burning Decadent, which was done with a drum machine. Was that like a huge like rewiring of your writing process working with a drummer, or did it come fairly naturally?
No, because I actually had this whole album written by the time the previous album was released, and that was before I had a real drummer. But one thing about that you mentioned is that I've got a lot more comfortable on this album with riff repeats other than 4 times. So, and that may be part of it, because like one revelation I had, there was this band I was seeing live. I can't remember who they were opening for, but they were just some random opening black metal band, and they were, you know, sucking all the air out of the room, and because that's what local black metal bands do typically. And they're like somewhere in the middle of the set, they start their next song, and I'm like, oh, holy shit, this is an awesome riff. Are they going to actually do something here? They repeat that riff 4 times, and they just go on to their next idea, which of course wasn't any good, and never went back to that first riff. And I'm like, oh fuck, guys, y'all could have made a whole song out of this fucking riff, and it would have been awesome. And that was kind of an awakening. It's like, maybe if I have a riff I really like, I just need to sit on it for a while sometimes. And that, I think that opened me up. That experience did, and made me more willing to repeat things, 8 or 16 times when needed.
Do you remember which band that was?
I do not remember their name.
So, I recently went to down in Fort Worth. There was a black metal show with Morbus 666, Thornspawn, and Sardonic Witchery. And I think it was Sardonic Witchery. They, for some reason, just had a terrible mix, and I politely...
Oh, that's fitting for everything else about that band.
It was the vocals and drums were way too loud. You couldn't hear any of the guitar work. And after the show, I was just, outside having a smoke, and the Sardonic Witchery guys were there, and I told them, I was like, hey, couldn't really hear the guitars in your mix, and they got really offended. Like, they just, completely walked away from me and all that. And yeah, it was kind of strange, because usually people are, little, they're interested in what, how their expression comes across to the audience, right? And you would think that would be like constructive criticism. It's not, bashing them as musicians. It was just the mix itself. But yeah, they not to their liking to receive constructive criticism for some reason.
Yeah, I've seen that band live. They were not the band in question here because, well, they couldn't have been, because I don't think they've ever had a riff good enough that they could build a song out of it. I have sat through one of their sets one time when they opened for Absu, and that's as far as I will go with them.
I mean, it's
definitely Morbus 666 and
that band's fucking killer. Like, Morbius are fucking killer.
Yeah, they got the Doomus guy, with the chainmail. They have him doing vocals now.
I've seen him with both of the old singers. I saw him both with Dave and with Seth from Ritual Decay. Nothing will ever top Seth from Ritual Decay's presence. I don't know if you've ever seen him with any bands before, but those who know. And of course, Dave is awesome in everything he's in. Yeah, that band is just so fucking good.
Yeah, they're real solid. Very coherent riffs and structure. I mean, it's pretty kind of standard in some ways, but still they're very effective with their song construction. But yeah, are there any other like DFW bands? I know Morbus 666 is more of a Houston band, but are there any like DFW bands that you can recommend other than like Absu?
Not that are currently active. DFW, okay, so our whole city has been forever tainted by the curse of Pantera. And so everything from our city is like either as dumb as Pantera or, it's new metal influence because Drowning Pool also came from here. Like this city is cursed when it comes to metal. So like if you live in DFW and you want good local metal, get used to driving to Austin or Houston.
See, I may not completely agree with that. I mean, Judas Goat was pretty solid for what they were, as well as they tend to be nice guys and all that. So I think they broke up though. But you're right that there's a lot of Panterisms here, which I've met Phil and Samo. Like I have a selfie of us peeing together. And a security detail actually went through my phone to make sure I didn't have any pictures of his phallus. But like the DFW, it's more of like there's the Panterism, so there's a lot of bands aping the groove metal style, as well as there's the brutal TXDM stuff with Devourment. But yeah, when it comes to
although speaking of death metal from Dallas, that does remind me, there is one band from DFW I can recommend. Cleric are pretty solid.
Yeah, I've seen Cleric. I've actually been on the bill with them a couple of times, I believe. They're pretty solid. Also, have you ever heard of Mortifix?
No, I have not.
Yeah, Mortifix was more like a grindcore band from the '90s, but they're pretty decent. They're also from the DFW.
Oh wait,
Yeah,
and the other obvious DFW band that's going now that I guess this would be fall under the obvious slash Absu category, but Maestus.
right. Jason Hans from Judas Goat just joined that band. So yeah, they're pretty good too. Very thrashy and all that. I'm trying to think. Is there like I know? Are you into neofolk at all? Because there's Alwyn. They're pretty decent.
I've never been into neofolk, no.
Well, Alwyn's pretty good for what they are. I know Wes Radinsky, Radvansky, or whatever Polish last name. He does a lot of black metal and solo project stuff too, and I do see a little bit of like post black metal influence in it, but it's so admirable like how much expression he's able to conjure up all by himself. But yeah, so Condemner obviously not playing shows if you're talking crap about sardonic witchery.
No, we can't play live because our drummer is not local to the Texas area. He's kind of far out, so that kind of takes that whole thing off the table for us.
I see. I see. We could always play with a drum machine live or get a session drummer or something like that, but it doesn't seem like that's really your goal.
Not particularly, no.
All right, Shelly, did you want to chime in?
I was gonna say it depends on the crowd in terms of using something like a drum machine. Like I only know anecdotes of the Texas scene through you guys, but it sounds like it's can be quite a combative audience at times that might not be accepting of a drum machine. Or have I got that wrong?
I think it would depend on the band. I just don't see a reason why you would perform live without a live drummer. Like the whole herder, we're going to use backing tracks live thing just needs to die in a fucking fire, and I'm not going to contribute to it.
Okay, we might have a difference of opinion there. I mean, it depends on. You're right. It like depends on the music, but also, I think a backing track can work as long as it's not being a stand-in for anything to do with the music itself. It really does depend.
Oh wow, nothing to do with the music itself, just the fucking drums. Nothing to do with the music itself.
Yeah, but it depends on how you're using the drum machine, whether it is literally because for you've recorded the album with a real drummer and you would be using a drum machine just to get the music out there in front of an audience, and it might affect the way that the expression comes across. But take a band like Godflesh, who are kind of formed around a drum machine, and it's a very powerful experience to see them live. I think it just depends on the context in which you're using this technology, I think.
I mean, given that the only reason I've ever used a drum machine was because I did not have a live drummer on the first two. Like, Godflesh is built around the idea of a drum machine. Condemner isn't so much. So in our case, it just does not make sense to do that.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. That's fair enough. Cool. Okay, so yeah.
I got a question, Paul.
Yeah.
I've read some of your lyrics, and they're kind of mean.
Well, yes, it's death metal. That tends to happen.
Well, I was going to ask. So we've discussed the fact that it's a Latin title, and the cover art is quite violent. So is there a concept behind the album? What's the concept? And inspiration for the lyrics?
So the lyrics are all, as you probably noticed, about torture and execution. The actual cover art. So this is kind of inspired. Well, the cover art is a reflection of actually track 3, I think it is, Weighing the Three Baptisms. So in the Spanish Inquisition, the way they would torture people is they would torture people in order with water first, then rope, then fire. And the reason for this, that they did this, was that basically the whole thing is we're baptizing the person we're torturing with each torture. So think of Jesus' life, right? He was baptized in the river by John the Baptist, then crucified, and then the Holy Spirit appeared as fire on the followers, and they were baptized by fire and all that bullshit. Well, I had the thought, it's like, well, okay, so, the order, take up your cross and follow him. Okay, we'll fucking help you with that, sure. And so I just turned that idea on its head, basically. So, we have Christians undergoing the torture of the Spanish Inquisition, taking up the cross and following their Lord. That was the idea for the cover art. That was also the idea for that song. But in general, it's torture and execution from multiple traditions, both actually more so the secular tradition than the Spanish Inquisition and the religious traditions. So I was, as I've said before, I always do lyrics very, very late in the process. After I had all of these songs musically written, I was just for fun reading a academic, an academic paper on the journal of Franz Schmidt, who was executioner in Germany back in the medieval ages for a while, and from there, that was where I saw the title "Mala Patratis Sunt, Atra, Theatra, Parata." Apparently, that was written on the walls of the torture chamber in the Nuremberg jail. That's also why the Latin's wrong, because Germans obviously didn't have great Latin. But I was like, oh shit, what's that mean? And then I Googled it, and I found that what it means is dark places are suitable for dark deeds. I'm like, holy shit, there's an album title. It's like, well, I think I have my album title now, and I think I also have the topic for the album now.
Well, there you go, Jason. That's why the lyrics are so mean.
Yeah, I read them, and I was like, oh, this Paul guy, he lives in the DFW. Go get a beer with him, but he might tell me to put the puppy in the basket.
No, I would tell you to put other humans in the basket, never a puppy.
So yeah, we sort of discussed a little bit like the fact that part of your initial inspiration was bands that bring the darkness back to death metal in a lot of ways, that moved you away from black metal. Like, what would you say is the fundamental difference between the two genres in an ideal sense?
That is a really hard question, and if you ask me on any different day, you'll get a different answer. Part of me is very, very sympathetic towards what Alex Books once said on Facebook, and that is that there's no difference between the two. He even went so far as to say that the Norwegian black metal kids, he's like, these were kids making death metal and just didn't realize they were making death metal because all the jogging suit kids had them confused about what death metal actually consists of. There's a big part of me that's very sympathetic towards that argument. If I had to place a guess, the difference lies on the physicality of it. Death metal always is going to have kind of a physical aggression element to it, a very physical energy to it. And black metal, there is black metal that has that for certain, but black metal frequently does not have that. If there is a difference, it lies in the presence or absence of that.
Yeah, that is an interesting way of looking at it, I suppose, because you're right. I was kind of being a bit mean with that question, because obviously it's quite hard to answer in a single way, because every rule you come up with, there'll be exceptions. So the moment you say physicality, for instance, I'm thinking bands that we've already mentioned, like Absu or Profanatica, who are very, very physical, but also there is a sense in which their music does still retains that black metal element to it, which is, it is an experience in a way. It's still what's the word? Immersive. Even if something like Profanatica, even if it is just sort of blind, dark rage, it's still quite an immersive, atmospheric experience in its own way, similar to something like Absu. I'm just using these two examples because they're fresh in my mind. And then you could say, yeah, there are death metal bands that are more ethereal and kind of understated, something like maybe Demigod, stuff like that. But yeah, they still retain the physicality as well. I don't know. What do you make of that, Jason?
Sorry, I wasn't paying attention. Can you repeat the question?
The fundamental difference between death metal and black metal is the physicality, i.e. death metal always has a physicality to it, whereas black metal generally does not.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I can agree with that 100%, but I do see the point, with bands such as you mentioned, the Absu and Profanatica. I think there's just a different philosophy with black metal altogether, where you could have various types of expression, whether it's spiritualism, like in the Emperor with the keyboards, or girl black metal such as Dark Throne. But I could agree a little bit with the physicality being part of it because in terms of physical spaces, there's anyone, can go to a death metal show, whereas black metal, when it started out, was kind of elitist. They didn't want just anybody to be present at their quote-unquote shows. More, some people today even call their shows as rituals. So, yeah, there's just a different philosophy between the two. And I think the physicality just may be part of that philosophy. But, yeah, that's kind of a loaded question. So I think Paul did a better job at responding, but I do apologize. I was sidetracked for
No, that's right. I mean, I was kind of asking it as well, just out of interest, Paul, in terms of like, would you ever go back to black metal, either in a different project or bring Condemner more in that direction, or was there a reason that you just prefer playing death metal?
Well, Condemner will never go into a more black metal direction. That would be completely counter to its purpose as a band. I have thought about doing a project. It wouldn't even be the project I have in mind that I've thought about doing and have actually written one song for that I've just never recorded. It's not even fully metal anymore, but would be kind of more towards that direction because what thing is that I was always really obsessed with Thorns' Grimmerk demo, the one with no drums. I'm sure you're familiar. I always thought that was just a really fascinating idea to just take all the percussive elements out of it. And in fact, the black metal band that I had before Condemner that I was doing with EC, it was just guitar and bass, no vocals, no drums. And I've thought about bringing something similar to that back, but even more minimalist, no bass even. Just a single distorted electric guitar and going more theme-based than riff-based. If I did another project like that, it would be like that, and you would hear hints of black metal in it, like a lot of ideas from my older black metal project would still creep into that, but that would be the direction that I would be going. Not something that would be immediately obviously recognizable as black metal.
Yeah, like it's one of those things where it strikes me as an avenue that has so much potential, especially because black metal has so much crossover with ambience as well. But I'm just surprised there isn't more of it. Like I can think of, there's examples in Iljan, Burzum, the Blazebirth Hall bands from Russia did a lot of that, where the drums are either just a steady beat in the background with no variation, or they are non-existent as well. But they took it in a much more like melodic and ethereal direction as well. And yeah, the early Fawns demos, but he never kind of built on that in any sense. It's just kind of exists as this weird anomaly of the early Norwegian scene. But yeah, that could be interesting because it sort of it builds on your idea again, your the thesis you just kind of articulated about the difference between death and black metal. It's sort of bringing black metal even further away from the physical and into a more passive kind of place, I suppose, in a good way.
Yep. So I do have. I'm going to be really nice, Paul. I know we exchanged comments on one Hate Meditations video, and I wasn't really that impressed by your new album. I don't mean that in a bad way. I just, like Shelley says, more like a step sideways and forward. And there are some tracks that I do view, they're kind of bloated. The mix is kind of weird. And I view that the shorter songs, they tend to be a little bit more solid than the longer meandering tracks. And you said that perhaps it may take me time to realize like the value in the longer songs. Can you elaborate on that? Can you tell me what I'm not seeing with it?
Well, without having access to your mind, I can't tell you what you're not seeing particularly. The longer songs, I would not call them meandering at all. Like the longest one on there is "Waiting the Three Baptisms." That song is super, super focused. I mean, you've got one theme, one counter theme established in the first riff. Those are split up into two separate riffs in the main section so that I could develop them both a little bit. Then you have a development section that speeds up where basically you're taking the counter theme, putting it back in a mode closer to the main theme, playing with that a little bit, and then you go back to a restatement, except that the counter theme is developed based on the development in the first theme. Like, I don't know how that song could be considered unfocused of all things. That one, I mean, that's the longest song on there, and it's probably the most focused,
Well,
or the
meandering
least
doesn't necessarily.
meandering.
Yeah, meandering doesn't mean unfocused. You can be really focused with meandering statements. But this, I found the longer tracks, they're kind of a slog to get through. And the shorter tracks, their statements were more firm. However, like I do like the 2018 album quite a bit. I think that's what really shows like the raw potentiality of the band. I just felt like this new release was kind of like Shelley said, where it's like a step sideways, rather than moving.
Well, let me just go out to bat for for Paul here, because I genuinely enjoyed the album, but I will freely admit that it did catch me off guard, and it did take me a few listens to get my head into it. And I think that is because, as you mentioned, it's even more stripped back. It has much more repetition going on, and yeah, as Paul kind of outlined, in some places it is super super focused. But I feel like if you just almost don't listen to it like a death metal album, I know that its raw materials are very much of those traditions. But I wouldn't treat it in the same way that I would just a random death metal album I come across. It's much more almost like mechanical in a way, and very, very monomaniacal, which I guess actually fits the theme of like torture in a way. Is just sort of
Yeah,
relentlessly
before you
plugging
came
away
in,
at one particular.
I was gonna even kind of remark to Jason. It's like you're saying that this song is kind of a drag to listen to, but it's literally a song about waiting in a jail cell to be tortured and the anticipation of it. I think that's a little fitting.
Yeah,
I
I
mean,
definitely agree with that.
I mean, that's not a good way to promote your music. It's like, yeah, this is going to torture you listening to it. But yeah,
Well, it depends it depends if you're talking in like
I mean,
metallic terms of like this.
I could see the DSBM people being into that, where they all want to kill themselves, and all right, let's put on some Condemner and blow our brains out. But
Well, I mean, I think it's a fun. I don't think it's necessarily a bad way to promote it. I mean, okay, people are always going to seek out, kind of quote unquote negative emotional experiences. I mean, like, look at movies. There's people. If you have someone watch a tragedy movie, they're going to and say like, was that experience overall positive or negative? Even though it evoked negative and quote unquote emotions, most of them will rate it as a positive experience, or like even it's something that's just more bluntly entertainment, like the video game world. Silent Hill 2 remake has been just lighting up the charts. It's not like that. It's not like just because something isn't immediately, oh, this is pleasant to listen to, that it's not satisfying in a deeper sense.
I mean, yeah, I'd agree with that. In that, it's something we always discuss in extreme metal. Part of its appeal is the fact that for most people, it's a deeply unpleasant listening experience. But we find meaning and understanding and sometimes beauty within that extremity. And I would say this album is no exception in that regard. It does come as it just comes across differently to your average death metal album. And again, I mean that as a compliment, because yes, it is understated and it doesn't sort of come out of the gate like immediately galloping at you, but in a way that's quite good. It sort of takes time to sort of grow into the experience. And yeah, it's sort of, you could also just say, a lot of death metal bands or extreme metal bands in general promote their music in that way. They never say, oh, this is going to be a pleasant experience for you. We've come up with some really like soothing sounds to relax to. Like, it's not that kind of music, is it? Cool. So yeah, any plans for the future? I know you've literally just released this album, so you're probably just sort of doing the rounds, sort of promoting that. But is there any sort of
doing the rounds and promoting? I don't do much in the way of promoting because I would rather stay invisible to the larger metal audience. A decision I made a long time ago is that my ideal size is just big enough that idiots can't find the band. I don't want, to have a fan base of people who like are buying most of what comes out on Century Media or whatever. So this is actually about the first thing I've done in the way of quote unquote promotion, other than just uploading the thing online and putting out a post on our Facebook saying, hey, it exists now. But as far as future, actually, so the next release it will be an EP. I've got my rough drafts for about 3/4 of it written. Now, the way I write, just having rough drafts doesn't mean it's anywhere near a release, because once I've got my rough drafts, what I do is I spend about a year or two or even more just playing those songs repeatedly. And it's like, okay, if I get tired of playing this song every day for a year, why is that? Fix the problem, repeat. Like a big part of my writing process is edit, edit, edit. So having my rough drafts down doesn't mean it's anywhere near release. But yes, the next release is planned. It will be an EP. I've got 3 of the 4 songs rough draft written at this point. And Jason will hate it. You might be interested in it because it is even further in this direction than Male Patratis is. It's even more stripped back in a lot of ways.
Yeah, I wouldn't say I'll hate it, because obviously it may just hit me differently than the last one. So yeah, I'll keep an open mind when I check it out when it comes out.
Awesome. Yeah. So I was interesting in what you said about sort of trying to remain sort of deliberately obscure, or only available to a certain audience that is going to sort of receive it in the way it's intended. Because sort of the way you and I made first contact was you just started commenting on some of my posts, but also sending me a lot of recommendations for stuff to check out. And as I've said before, but I do appreciate being steered towards particular releases that I might have missed, or we have a quick exchange about it. What's your do you have any bands that you're particularly interested in at the moment as a fan? Anything that sort of really sort of caught your attention?
Well, I mean, nothing that's not like the obvious choices, I mean, obviously there's plenty of metal bands going that I like. I like Imprecation a lot. Lurking Terror, I do like that new EP a lot. Deceased are a favorite, of course. But I mean, it's all stuff that it's nothing that you would not have heard of, because if I really liked it, I would have probably sent it your way if you hadn't already posted about it. So, because I post pretty much anything I listen to and think is even worth a second listen to, you probably are familiar with anything I'm going to be listening to recently.
Well, the listeners might not be, though, so feel free to share anything.
Fair enough. So I guess of stuff this year, other than the obvious stuff like Wormvold, full disclosure, we share a member, but I really liked that EP. Just really, really vicious stuff. Kind of.
Sorry. Did you just say we share a member?
Not like that, but but yeah, that it's like Necrovore meets Impiety almost. Really vicious EP. That Wormvold EP, Vengeance Eclipsing Red. I really liked that. That's kind of the only more obscure-ish thing this year I've liked. This year's been kind of a weak year for it. The only other things I've really cared about are the Lurking Terror EP and the Deceased album, and of course my own album, and that's kind of it for things this year I've really liked.
I definitely agree with you on the Deceased album, because I think we share a love of them. You say it's been a weak year. Jason and I have discussed this at length in terms of when the last time we had a strong year was. But one thing that you two might agree on, and I don't know how far you want to go down this one, but the Fighters have a new album coming out, but I know that you're not the biggest fan of them.
I liked their Widrum Hymn EP. I don't like anything they did after it.
Wow. I think we're cut from the same cloth, Paul.
The new one, I heard the 2 tracks they posted, and I'm just like, why is anyone trying to mimic the new Abigor albums? Because that's basically what they're turning into with here.
I see.
I think I've only listened to one of the new Abigor albums, and that was a couple of years ago now. And yeah, I did not care for it. I'm waiting till the Fighters album comes out. I think it's at the end of the month, because I've only listened to the tracks they've released once. So I'm going to withhold my view on them. But obviously, I make no bones about the fact that I do really rate them as one of the more interesting, more recent bands. But I know that you two disagree with me on that.
I think they have the right approach where it comes to how the songs are constructed. However, the content is what I typically have issues with the Mephitis. The riffs just don't do anything for me personally.
See, I'm almost the exact opposite there. I think their riffs are mostly, well, okay, on Ember Dawn, I will say the riffs are mostly decent, but they're very impatient in terms of their songwriting. Like they're always like, okay, we've got A, which goes to B, which goes to C, which goes to D, which goes to E, which goes to F. It's like, okay, cool.
Yeah, I think that's
what about the
their
connections between A
at the
and
gates.
C and B
Yeah.
and F? And
Yeah, I think it's the At the Gates influence they have, if they have any. I mean, I see a similar logic with early At the Gates, where they try to make it sophisticated in the song construction, where it's like they throw all these different ideas at you in rapid unison, rapid succession. And personally, like At the Gates is not my jam, which is obviously why I'm not keen on similar approaches to the At the Gates, like the Mephitis. However, I disagree. We're like Ember Dawn. Yeah, there's some serviceable riffs on there, but the one after that, I viewed it like 50%. Like if I was to give it like a grade, it would be like a 50% because I think the intellectual side is there. And it's very refined. However, there's like no soul to the music. It's like a golem. You know what like a golem is, like the Jewish golem.
I would
like,
agree very much with that statement on the second full length. My thing with that album is that it got very literal. Everything on it is just like very demonstrative, very literal about how it's presented. And to paraphrase Schopenhauer here, music's not representative. It's a reflection directly of the will. And so like when we're having like when we're trying to make the songs very literally reflect what they're thematically about.
It's a copy of the will. For Schopenhauer, music's a copy of the will, not a reflection.
Okay. You get the gist of it. The idea is that it comes directly from the will. It's not like a representation, like where, for instance, a painting is representative of something of the world. It doesn't come directly from the will, right? Music is not a painting.
Well, a painting definitely has the will in it. Phenomenal reality is all part of the will.
Yes, but there's still a layer in between, right? It's an extension.
Well, Schopenhauer argued that paintings elevate the species essentially, where the way you said it takes the ever transforming world into a single moment and elevates the species. And he did say nature oriented art in that regard is the kind of art that can endure more than like mythological and historical blah blah blah. But continue.
But so we're getting off the topic. But the thing with Mephitis is that they're so very literal about everything they do. It's not, we're going back to, hey, music's not a literal art form, but they're trying to make it very literal. Like the worst is like that slam poetry bit at the end of Casing Its Sediments, like where they're trying to sound like someone drowning in sand and all that. It's like, this isn't music anymore, though. Now you're just kind of making the sound of someone drowning in sand. You're not representing this melodically and structurally. I've got a lot of that against that album. There's a lot of that going on that. And then, of course, the two songs I've heard from the new one, they've just gone full-blown into Newer Abigor, which if you've not heard Newer Abigor, basically it's the Last Emperor album, but reined in a tiny bit. That's the direction they're going, and no one fucking wants that.
Oh, they got signed to a bigger label. Which label was that, Shelley?
Profound Lore.
Yeah, Profound Lore, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
That's a pretty big label. So the label might see some potentiality in terms of revenue. But yeah, it's one of those bands. They're a little too on the nose, and it's not necessarily bad being on the nose, but like I've already, I don't want to turn this into a shit on Mephitis episode, but I definitely share some of the same sentiments you have towards them. And I do view the 2018 album from Condemner better than anything Mephitis has put out, including Ember Dawn.
Well, it's interesting. I don't want to be just the guy that says that's mediating everything. Is like, I like everything, but it's interesting that the direction that Condemner has taken on their latest album is basically the opposite of all of the critiques you were leveling at Mephitis, Paul, in that like they do go from A to B to C to D to E and rarely circle back to a riff in a way that sort of more traditional death metal does, whereas you you've almost done the opposite in the way you described that track off the new album, for instance, is very, very logical in the way that it circles back to a theme and then it develops a theme and blah blah blah. It's like the two strands of modern extreme metal splitting off, and I see value in both depending on what it is that bands are trying to put across. Like, I understand what you guys are saying about problems with Patratis, and yeah, I don't think they're a perfect band by any means. I just think they're one of the more interesting bands that I've encountered, and I think they kicked up a fuss in certain circles, but it's not like they're, you know, massive or anything, or sort of doing what a band like Blood Incantation will do, where I've got non-metal friends discussing them no end now because that release kicked up such a storm. But I guess, yeah, I just wanted to dovetail that into, like, we said that this year's been pretty weak. Jason and I might sometimes discuss the fact that I can't remember the last time there was a strong year. Like, what's your sense of, like, the health of extreme metal these days? Is it kind of just a curiosity that's sort of long past its prime now, or is there any sort of, do you have any optimism for the future?
If you'd asked me a couple of years ago, I probably would have had a lot more optimism for the future of it than I do now. I'm lucky enough to live in Texas, where there you could still go to shows and see underground metal performed and appreciated the correct way. Based on what I have seen and heard from other places, that does not appear to be common. It feels like most of extreme metal, and I'm using that term very loosely because it's not actually extreme metal in the way that it was intended to be and practiced in the early 90s. It feels like most of it is going to the model that pop music is, where basically it's like, oh, hey, here's something that's basically all the same thing that we can roll off the assembly line. It's great if you're a label, because here's the thing. Labels want you to be listening to something that they can easily reproduce, except, ooh, this time we have a flute. Ooh, this time we have a female singer, so that they can always just roll the next one off the assembly line. That means that big labels don't want good or interesting bands, because a good or an interesting band, you can't just roll the next one off the assembly line. So like extreme metal in general has become very much a product. And unfortunately, even people who know better are, interacting with the product ecosystem in a lot of ways. Like, you could see a lot of releases that are from legitimate underground labels, but then, like, they'll get covered on some blog like No Clean Singing or Invisible Oranges or whatever. And it's like, okay, we know you had to have sent them a promo to get there. So you're, basically kind of pushing towards the productization of your own art in a way here. You're kind of ultimately killing your own babies here. And that's kind of what makes me most pessimistic of the future, is like, underground's got to start acting like the underground again if we're going to, get out of that malaise. Otherwise, it's just going to be slowly the Century Media bands take over everything and choke out more and more and more and more and more of it. And as a result of that, it's going to be letting in more and more and more people who don't belong here. That's the ultimate problem of the future. Like, to an extent, I think that there's a little bit of impatience with people like demanding new styles and such, because how long did classical in the common practice period, so like all of Baroque through all of modernist classical before serialism fucked the whole thing up, how long did that go for? Like hundreds and hundreds of years, right? In metal, we're not even close to that yet, and there's plenty of room to improve upon even the likes of Obscura or Blessed or the Sick or Philosophum. We can make better albums, but the problem is always going to be the fact that we're not acting like the underground anymore, that to an extent our sense of elitism is disappearing too much, and it's always going to make the noise to signal racial very, very bad, and it's going to make it hard to find the few good albums that do exist.
So just to kind of just to chime in about the No Clean Singing, I personally have written quite a few articles for them, and none of what I read about were from promos. But I know Islander from No Clean Singing has received a shit ton of promos, and sometimes you can kind of tell with his roundups of, just kind of essentially just working the PR queue, essentially.
Well, I get the same. I get the same promos through Hate Meditations. I can see on Mystification Zine and No Clean Singing when they're covering the same stuff. It's just the difference is I will delete most of the ones I get. I do
Yeah, I
give them a
don't.
fair shake, but I only review the ones that have anything worth noting.
I view No Clean Singing as actually one of the better websites out there. On Mystification, the Grizzly Butts guy is pretty good too, because No Clean Singing, they've let me write about whatever the hell I wanted to write about. They impose no restrictions on me at all. So
Okay, maybe they were a bad example. I was just naming them because they were one of the larger ones and they were one of the first ones that came to mind. But like that whole industry apparatus of blogs, like maybe not them, but like Invisible Oranges, Angry Metal Guy, Metal Cucks, all of those, I think I've maybe read 2 No Clean Singing articles ever, so it's fair enough. Take it as you will. I just assumed they are what they are because they're part of that whole.
They are. I mean,
the right
they're part of
size
the
that they've gotta be.
machine. Yeah, they're part of the machine. However, they're
exactly.
not. They're not. They don't have any ads or anything. It's just a hobby for them. Like that's like their main thing is where just write about new metal coming out. And I've talked quite a bit with Islander. He's been on this podcast, and it's really interesting how he got into extreme metal. It's through his kid, so he's definitely a late bloomer. But yeah, he just tends to write about pretty much everything, which can be kind of daunting, especially that he tends to be really positive about everything too. So if you read an Islander review, you may not be able to decipher what the faults of any release is. You would have to listen to it, and usually there are substantial flaws. But yeah, I understand what you mean about Metal Sucks and Toilet of Hell and Metal Injection to a point as well. Blabbermouth, all that. It's part of the machine, and it's obviously driven by revenue.
Are Metal Injection even a metal site anymore?
I don't know.
Are Metal Injection even a metal blog anymore? Because like I see them in my Facebook feed, and they're always talking about Nickelback or some shit, and I'm just like, what the fuck?
They gotta generate that revenue, and yeah, Nickelback. There you go. But when you're
it's all content for them.
when you're talking about like how long classical music existed and like with the different periods, like each period, like the Baroque period lasting for over 200 years essentially. Well, not 200, maybe like 150, where you have the CPE Bach doing the proto-classicism. So the periods, they did last a lot longer than I think genres last today. And yeah, I definitely see we're in the downward trajectory of metal as a whole. Nowadays, you have a lot of harsh textures in popular music. Like they call it cyber metal. It's in video game music now, like the Doom soundtrack and all that. It's technically, like texturally speaking, metal, but it's just about the percussive aspect of metal. It's not none of the rhythm or anything like that. But yeah, I think it's a little bit different nowadays, where things come and go out of fashion a lot faster. But there are obsessives in metal, which is definitely kept it around for like 50 years now. It's crazy. But what is popular today is kind of removed from the original spirit of extreme metal of the late 80s and early 90s. It's more of like a vibe. And a lot of the bands use the same templates for song construction with a chorus and all that. And I find that more like leftovers from like rock music than I do of metal. So there's a lot of issues with modern metal. And yeah, I think it will fizzle out eventually. May take another 20 years, but I don't see a lot of new top tier bands like Morbid Angel or anything like that coming out of nowhere. I think what you're going to have is a lot of people doing gent and deathcore and all that, and that's going to be what survives longer than what we tend to cherish.
I don't know that it will. Like, okay, so there's not many bands doing proper death metal now, but I mean, like, you can still find a new band coming out, whether it's, Condemner, whether it's Wormvold, whether it's Cruciamentum. There are still proper death metal bands coming out every so often. Meanwhile, like, let's go back in time a little bit. what's the last melodic death metal band in the style of like In Flames that came out? That's dead as fuck. What's the last new metal band that came out? Like, okay, it still lives on in Dallas because Dallas is fucking retarded. But like, outside of Dallas, what's the last new metal band that has existed? Outside of Dallas, what is the last glam band that has existed? And again, it's sad that I have to say outside of Dallas for that category as well, but I do. But like those things are dying off in my view a lot faster. Like, yes, we get fewer proper death metal bands in any given year than we do deathcore bands or whatever. But I think our long tail is going to last a lot longer.
I forgot to mention fucking South America. So like Brazil and Chile and all that, they have a lot of like OSDM, but not our kind of OSDM that just functions on vibe. There's a lot of bands that are trying to capture that early 90s death metal sound, and they're more genuine with their approach than like the blood incantations and all of that. So I totally forgot to mention that there is death metal really strong in South America right now. Now, do I view any of it as being like A tier, S tier? No, I don't. However, there are a lot of promising projects. There was that cover band from Israel that was also pretty good too. They had a lot of potential, but I think they broke up.
Yeah, they well, my understanding is that it's a new band now. I'm blanking on the name, but it's that band that's kind of that Angel Corpse-y thing that they're doing now. That's their new project.
I see, Angel Corpse-y. So it's a poor man's Morbid Angel.
Yeah, kind of. Although it's more of the war metal-y side of Angel Corpse. Like it's sort of at this Angel Corpse blasphemy direction. It's more interesting than most war metal, though, thankfully. But yeah, that's kind of what they're doing now. I can't remember the name of the band. God damn. I know my drummer, when he hears this, is just going to be facepalming because he's a huge fan of them. But
But yeah, like going back to the topic, like I definitely agree that I think sort of metal in a sense needs to split, because when you were saying like when was the last time a new metal band formed, I was like, well, I don't even know if they're considered a new metal band, but something like Sleep Token comes to mind as a band that suddenly got really popular, but is barely even approaching something that I would recognize as metal. And in that sense, it doesn't really offend me because it's like hearing a pop song, but just occasionally they play a loud chord. Or in terms of glam, something like Ghost, which is kind of just a carnival of different elements of like, Kiss and Merciful Fate and psychedelic rock and things all wrapped up in a big Disneyfied bow. But that, again, it's so sort of far removed from what I listen to, the kind of understanding of metal that I have, that I don't even consider it as to be part of the same genre, let alone the same scene. So in that sense, the underground, you could have optimism for the underground because, yeah, as you mentioned a couple of bands there that are really good. I agree with Jason that there are a lot of good bands coming out of South America, in particular Chile. And yeah, it's nothing like the explosion in the 90s, but we really need to sort of see that as an anomaly now. It's just that was like the creation myth, the Big Bang, whatever you want to call it. But that was an anomalous moment when there was a high quantity of very good quality bands. And as you said, we're kind of living in the long shadow of that. And there are bands that are kind of beavering away, putting out quality material, kind of almost in like a holding pattern, just waiting for the next Morbid Angel or something. But there is reason to be more optimistic than I sometimes let myself be, because I encounter so much of the awful side of it, where it is just people cosplaying with folk instruments, or just another generic Dark Throne ripoff, or another OSDM band in the sort of cut from the same cloth as Tumult or something. And in the face of that, it is easy to sort of lose faith. But if you just focus on the good, then there's cause for hope, I would say.
Well, again, like I say, we've got to start acting like the underground again. Every time you interact with, an above ground entity, but you're an underground band, you're eating your own children and you're contributing to your own demise in the long term. That's the thing that we've got to start learning. Like, you've got to treat Blood Incantation fans the same way that Paul Bailoff would have treated Rat fans. We're not doing that. And if a blog, if a blog praises Blood Incantation or they praise, I don't know, whatever the fuck else is big at the moment, like Oransi Pazuzu, they come to mind. If a blog praises any of that shit, you have to treat them the same as a magazine that just wrote a glowing article about Motley Crue back in the 80s. But we're not doing that. So many bands and so many labels are just desperate for, the revenue that they're flirting with those streams, and that's just not going to work. We got to start acting like the underground again.
Yeah, and in some sense, you kind of have to run counter to the incentives on social media. So as you were saying, when you released the new Condemner album, you didn't really do any promotion for it. It's sort of uploaded to Bandcamp, a Facebook post, and then you're doing this interview, and we're a relatively small platform as well, and we're kind of the same, we share a lot of the same views on extreme metal and stuff. But yeah, for most bands, that's counter to all of the incentives they receive across their social media accounts. The labels the same, PR companies as well. It's literally their raison d'etre is spreading the message far and wide, which, yeah, it is counter to what the original spirit of the underground was. But in particular, something like second wave black metal, which made a point of saying you have to be a certain kind of person to discover and like the music. It's not an endeavor that wants to attract as many fans as possible in any way. Right. And we've got to get back to a point where someone at least has to be curious to find it. So someone has, I'm not saying that a band should be completely invisible, but I mean, with Condemner, it's like, okay, we've got reviews on deathmetal.org, we've got reviews on your blog, we've got reviews on, we got a review on Old Disgruntled Bastard, although sadly that blog seems to be rarely posting now. Anyone can find Condemner as a result of that. I'm confident of that. Yeah, but at the same time, it's not out there to the extent that anyone who's not somewhat naturally curious is going to run across it. And that needs to be where metal is in general. If you go back in the day, when I was getting into metal, or into extreme metal, I will say, so this would be late 90s, early 2000s, I took the same path that most people did, Metallica to Slayer to everything else. So everyone knew Metallica. If you like the old Metallica albums, you will Google some things, you will run across Slayer. If you like Slayer, you will find a magazine talking about something a little more extreme. The way I got into it was I saw an article about Emperor, and I was like, that sounds interesting. It was an interview with Isan around 9 Equilibrium era. I was like, this sounds interesting. I checked out their first album because I had been around metal long enough to know that the first album was usually the best. It's like, yeah, I like this. He also mentioned Bathory and Hellhammer. Let me go check those out. And so it kind of went from there. But if you're curious if you're curious, there's threads to follow. But we need to be like that, where you've got to follow threads. You've got, you can't just be like, oh, here's what the biggest magazine said. If you're in the biggest magazine, you're doing yourself a disservice in the long run. Yeah, and there's a sense in which a lot of fans are just spoon-fed the content on their news feeds and don't really think past that in a lot of ways, which is why, sort of paradoxically, metal is probably at its most popular, but it's also at its most decentralized at the moment. There's not many big, it's easy to forget, Morbid Angel were huge at one point. They're that rare intersection of a high quality band that got massively popular. And that doesn't really happen anymore, except for bands that are really good at, playing to people's likes, like a Blood Incantation. That's why their artistic statements are so incoherent, because they try to do exactly what journalists at Pitchfork or Invisible Oranges or The Quietus will praise them for, in a similar way to something like Ghost as well, just because they're on my mind. They're almost like a recommendation algorithm made flesh in a lot of ways. Whereas, yeah, you'd need fans that are actually have that commitment and are willing to dig beneath the surface a little bit more to find something of a little bit more thoughtful.
Who knows, Shelley? It's interesting to kind of think about how distinct the above ground is versus the underground, and I kind of share some of Paul's sentiments in that regard. where you do need to be a little bit more firm on your stance. Like, I'm sorry for saying sardonic witchery is good. Honestly, the music's not, my forte or anything like that, but I just thought it was interesting that they couldn't even take any constructive criticism. It's not even really about the music, it was about their mix live. And it kind of shows, like, you have to, and I'm sorry for ruffling your feathers today in regard to your new album, but I forgot where I was going with this, but I do view Condemner
Never fucking
as
apologize,
a quality
dude. Never
project.
apologize.
Well, I am sorry. So I just broke your fucking rule. What you gonna do? You gonna beat me up, Mr. Mean Man, writing mean lyrics?
I think it does speak to the idea that criticism, because we were discussing those other sites like Known Clean Singing. I love Mystifications and I love his writing style, but I have an issue with the fact that he never comes down too hard on an album. That I think a lot of the stuff he covers is average or forgettable. And I know because I don't review most of it because I get sent the same promos as the guy. And yeah, again, that's no disrespect to him. He's very dedicated and very, very thoughtful, far more dedicated than me because I don't have the time to put out anywhere near as much of the material that he does. But it's the same thing where it's like everyone's afraid to be overly critical of stuff. And it's kind of, again, I guess that speaks to your point, Paul, is like, as well as remaining underground and going against that instinct to try and get in the bigger mags, is this idea that we do have to just call out bullshit in a more forceful way sometimes and just say, no, that's shit. Don't listen to it.
Yeah, I would agree with that completely. I'd be pretty hypocritical if I didn't.
Yeah. Awesome. Is there anything else you want to raise in terms of like either Condemner or any other bands you want to push or anything else you want to discuss? I don't have any other questions left, so
that pretty much covers it as far as Condemner goes and what our future holds. Yeah, EP will be coming when it's done. Expected in maybe a few years' time.
Awesome. Yeah, watch this space. And yeah, like as we've discussed at length, you can find Condemner on Bandcamp. I've covered them on Hate Meditations and yeah, on Facebook as well. So yeah, they've just got a new album out released earlier this year with the Latin
physical
name.
copies
So, yeah.
will come eventually. They got delayed for a few reasons, but I should be getting back on that track again soon. There will be a physical copy of it. If not this year, probably early 2025.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll definitely pick one of them up when it's available. Cool. Well, yeah, thanks very much for coming on, Paul. It's great to talk to you again after quite a few years. And yeah, thanks again for all the recommendations and the thoughtful comments and stuff. Keep them coming. Cool. And yeah, thanks as always, Jason. I'm sort of taking over hosting here, but
Yeah, I know Paul's more
apologies.
your guy than my guy, so you're welcome to.
Awesome. Well, yeah, thanks very much, Jason. It's been awesome as always, and thank you very much for listening. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.